Okay, great, thank you. Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for having me here. I really appreciated this invitation to come and speak about citation of data and software and also persistent identifiers. So I work at the British Library as Research Identifiers Lead, and what that means in actual fact is that I'm project managing the British Library's contribution to a European-funded project all about persistent identifiers, which is called FREYA. I'm based in the UK, but I'm from Ireland originally, and what that seems to mean is that I can talk very quickly. So please do tell me to slow down if I start speaking too quickly and you can't understand me, or if you can't hear as well. The other housekeeping thing, which I think, did I put that? Which was here. So please do ask questions throughout the morning as well, and feel free to interrupt me, and if there's anything that you want clarification on or to talk about a bit more. In terms of the aims for this morning, hopefully by the end of the morning, we'll have covered the importance of persistent identifiers within research, how to cite data and software in research publications, and also talk a bit about sort of some of the issues that you might encounter with citing data and software, and we can discuss hopefully some strategies about how to deal with those as well. So, as yesterday sounds like it was quite intense, I thought we could have a little easy start to the morning. So I'm going to play a short video. So this is from the UK Data Service about data citation.
We are living in a world of data.
It's important to cite data correctly, much in the way that you would cite an article, a website, or an image.
Two reasons to cite data correctly. The first is that it's an acknowledgement of a primary source that's being used in research. So it's good scholarly practice to cite data in the same way that you might cite a book as a primary source. The second reason is for research funders to be able to track the use of the data that they support.
People want to go back and look at the analysis that's been done. Unless you know where the data sets come from, then you're not sure that the analysis has actually been done correctly.
This is the foundation of social research and research in general, and it is about finding the truth, finding the patterns.
People can build on what you've done, so they're more likely to cite you, and that's really good for you as a researcher as you're developing your career and your research.
It's quite a simple task to cite data correctly, so the UK Data Service provides a kind of copy and paste function.
DOI is a digital object identifier, and every data set should have this.
The DOI is a web address which will never disappear, it remains constant. It is like a fingerprint. It's made up of a string of letters. The first part is references the publisher. For example, the UK Data Service has a number. The second part is the name of the data collection. The next part is the version.
It's kind of like if you lose your bank card, you still have your account number. You don't lose that. Same with the data set. If the data set moves, you still have the DOI to identify the data.
It allows the funders to get visibility of who's using the data that they've supported. If there wasn't the funding available, the ESRC's funding, for example, for Understanding Society, or even the UK Data Service itself, wouldn't be able to continue. So researchers have a really important role to play if they want the data that they rely on to continue to be made accessible to them.
But also, as a data producer, studies like Understanding Society, we try to publicise research using our data because it demonstrates the value of the study. And so through our website and through our conversations with government departments, we would be telling them about your research if we know about it because you've cited our study.
Okay, so that was just a short overview of why you might want to consider citing data. I wasn't here yesterday afternoon when you were discussing sort of about what data is in the humanities and what type of data you all work with. But can I just double check, and also actually in light of the fact that I know there's quite a few librarians here as well, is that correct? How many of you would say that you sort of actively work with data on a sort of, in your day-to-day work? If I can have a show of hands, yeah. Okay. Okay, so some of you. And how many of you would say that you work with software as well? And in terms of creating software and writing it, or just using software? Okay. All right, so we've got a bit of a mix here. So we'll cover a bit about, so in terms of those of you who didn't raise your hands, is that, I'm trying to establish what that means. Does that mean that you don't have any data in your research, or is it because you're just not working in a research role? The second one, okay. All right, that's fine. So, and of those of you, would you work in a kind of advisory capacity to researchers as well? Would you work in an advisory capacity to researchers? Yeah.
Many of us are researchers also.
Yeah, okay. Okay, but do you work with data? Because there wasn't. Yes. Okay. Okay. Please raise your hands and tell me, because otherwise I don't know. Okay. Great. Right. So hopefully by the end of this, anyway, you will have some idea about citing data and software. Okay. So I think there's a few more of you here than I thought there was going to be. But this room divides quite nicely into 3. So can I ask everyone over this side to just take one of those and pass it on? And you can have a look at it. And I'm reaching the end of my lead. And here as well. And yeah, just sort of around. For those, if there aren't enough to go around, then maybe we can just work together. No, just have a look. Yeah, so I don't think we've got enough. Okay, well. Right, so on those pieces of paper, so can you raise your hand if you've got a piece of paper? Actually, that's probably the easiest thing. Okay. You have, okay, great. You don't have, okay, well. Yeah, no, well, you don't need to work in pairs. You're going to work kind of, this third of the room is going to work together, this third and this third from the piles I gave out, okay? And what you have on that piece of paper is a piece of a citation of a data set. And what I would like you to do is to try and put that citation in order. So I want you to work together, and perhaps, I'm trying to think where would be a good place to put those. I think maybe we might kick them over, but maybe if we could just put them down here, just at the front. Here, if you can stand up and just bring them down. And maybe if you can just arrange on this side, if you could just arrange them over here.
I don't know if it's visible because there's the dots at the end. Oh, maybe.
His first name.
And then, yeah, the name should go first.
I have Like the magazine is
This is the data set, so this is
some people put what is the time.
But doesn't order depend on the citation format?
Okay, yeah. That's great.
No, I don't know if I'm right.
Okay, we'll leave it here.
Because we have a link and then we have
You're not saying.
I'm not saying
Those brackets,
yeah, it's funny when you see them, isn't it? It's hard to know.
Yeah.
Oh, you know already.
the version of
Eventually, end of evening. I thought so as well about it advanced.
Do you think are you ready? Okay, well then you can sit back down again. Yeah, please sit down when you're ready and then we'll okay. Are you happy? Okay. So I'm aware this might get kicked by people when we stand up later, but if we leave that for now, we can we'll see. Oh, I need to put my mic back on, sorry. We'll see. There we go. Okay, so we'll see which ones, how correct you are. I think broadly speaking, you're probably about right. Because you all do citations all the time. People know about these things. It's not that hard. Oh, wrong way. Okay, so that was just a bit of an icebreaker, really, just to get you thinking and just aware of what we're going to be covering today. But then I thought I'd talk about persistent identifiers first, because persistent identifiers are very important to my work, and they're sort of what I work with all the time and what I'm involved with, so I thought it would make sense to sort of start things off with that, because they're a very important component of citation as well. So can anyone tell me, if anyone care to offer a guess about, or a view on what a persistent identifier is? Anyone? So at the visit yesterday, we heard a bit from PT Chris that they're working with persistent identifiers. So, oops. So a persistent identifier is a long-lasting reference to a resource. So this is, I've borrowed this and quite a lot of these slides from colleagues of mine at DataCite, which is an organization that provide persistent identifiers in the form of DOIs, particularly for datasets. So the DOIs, I think, in all of these citations actually would have come from DataCite. And so a DOI is a type of persistent identifier. An ORCID ID is another type of persistent identifier. Are these terms familiar to? Is there anyone who is not familiar to? Okay, great. But the sort of umbrella term for all of these types of identifiers is a persistent identifier. And the reason they're called persistent identifiers is because as a condition of creating these identifiers, whichever organization is creating it has sort of made a contract to make sure that those identifiers remain active and remain alive for a long period of time. And then the identifier is that it's unique, so that you can identify the particular resource. So this is a bit text heavy, but this is how they work. So generally speaking, you have an identifier, and then in the back, sort of behind that identifier, you have a registry that associates the identifier with some metadata about the resource. That resource can be a person, it can be an article, it can be a data set, it can be an organization, it can be many different types of things. And generally speaking, when you see them in text, so you can see, because this was just printed out of Microsoft Word, you can see the way they're underlined because it's a hyperlink, the DOI. So for example, so this one, nope. If I can get through this session without falling over, I'll be doing really well. So this one is just a DOI. You can tell it's hyperlink, but it's just the identifier itself. Whereas this one, because it's got the HTTP, it's the full URL. So they can be expressed in different ways, and that's as a result of different citation styles. Wrong way. So I've mentioned a few of these already, but what kind of things can have a persistent identifier? Please tell me.
Publications.
Publications? Okay, what types of publications?
So articles or books or chapters in books.
Yeah.
Depending on your decision.
On your decision?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can
Yeah.
put it on the whole book, or if different chapters have different authors, for example, you could put it on different chapters.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, there's I think it's probably fair to say that there isn't a uniformity of practice at this point about sort of the levels at which you'd assign it an identifier when it comes to books, whether it's at the chapter or the whole book level. Anything else?
Persons, organizations, funders, data sets,
Yeah.
images,
Yeah. Yeah, the project I work on, we did a report last year where I think we came up with something like 50 different types of entities that can have identifiers. So here's just an example. Yeah, so we've covered all of these ones. Also, potentially some other types that may be of relevance to this audience. Yes, Ursula?
Text fragments.
Text fragments, yes, exactly. And things like there's, yes?
maybe locations and geodata.
Yes, that was exactly what I was just trying to say. Anything else?
Say, what are text fragments?
Like, I have a digitized manuscript, and I want to unambiguously identify a certain part of it. It can be a character, it can be a section, it can be a sentence, it can be a line, whatever. And I can just put an query or whatever, an arc or whatever kind of persistent identifier.
So often, like digitized textual material in various forms might have an identifier, which might be slightly different. I know of some Roman coins that have DOIs, sound material, audiovisual things. Basically, you can assign persistent identifiers to many, many things. Now, why use persistent identifiers? Anyone care to offer any thoughts on this? Any?
Because you want to have persistent references to some objects that will last.
Yeah. Yeah. Can anyone think of any other reasons why they might be useful?
And you want to uniquely identify the same objects, so to differentiate them from others.
Yeah. Yeah. So sort of unambiguous identification. Yeah. Did you?
Things can be written differently in different languages and so on.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also some,
Yeah. So it's again, yeah, unambiguous. Anyone else? Yes.
We can make scholarly contributions more visible that are not necessarily books or articles.
Yeah. So I suppose that's kind of through assigning identifiers to a wide range of objects, but also even toward, yeah, so I suppose these probably cover things that, not necessarily the range of objects, but just by assigning an identifier to a data set, for example, you kind of engender all of these things within the item. This image I chose kind of because I sort of like the way it sort of represents linking and like connection between different entities, and the way that their hands are unique. So it's a unique thing, and you can build these connections as well. So just to go into a bit more detail on that. So persistent identifiers are trustworthy because it can, if you were to assign an identifier to a particular type of resource, it lends a degree of trustworthiness to it, because in order to get that persistent identifier, you have had to go through registration with, depositing that resource, for example, with a data repository. So it generally means that you've had to meet a certain threshold in order to publish the resource in this way. The registration agencies for DOIs, there are 2 of them, and other types of identifiers, generally they have to meet certain standards themselves, they're contractual obligations, therefore it just lends an element of trustworthiness. And also, because it's a persistent identifier as well, anyone who's using that resource, and if you're using resources yourselves in your research, if it has an identifier, you can be pretty sure that you can cite it with a degree of security, knowing that that citation will remain active for a long period of time. So yesterday, when Daniel was speaking about web archiving, and he was talking about error 404 and things, persistent identifiers remove that as an issue, because as part of these contractual requirements, if the URL of a resource changes, as part of the contractual obligation, you have to update your URL, the connection between the URL and the DOI throughout the life cycle or the lifetime of the resource, or forever. It's part of your obligation. Or if that resource comes down for whatever reason, and it becomes inaccessible, you need to have some sort of, they tend to call them tombstone pages. So some sort of page that says, look, this resource did exist, it doesn't anymore, here's why, or something, but just so that you still have that sort of paper trail and that traceability. So,
are they updated manually or automatically?
It depends on whoever's created it, or whoever, whatever, like repository, for example, that's using it. So, for example, with things like publications, it can happen. For example, if someone's upgrading their platform, they'll all the URLs will change, and then that can be done in kind of quite a batch way. But then sometimes it might be a bit more manual, depending on the number and depending on the resources of the organizations involved. Sorry, I keep going the wrong way. Disambiguation, is this familiar to people about the sort of some of the benefits of ORCIDs? I think it was touched on yesterday. So this is an example of my colleague Robin. She's a great example because she got married and she changed her name, which can be sometimes hard to find people when you out of the blue. But as you can see here, this is a snippet out of Robin's ORCID ID that we can see all of her alternative names. So she can be RH Dazzler or L Dazzler or L Howard, and then she's published under all of these different names. And another thing I wanted to point to, though, I was told in advance that most of you probably would have ORCID IDs. Is that true? Do most of you have ORCIDs? Okay. How many of you sort of have populated them with a lot of information, or have you just sort of created them and sort of not put anything in and left them? Because I think this snippet, I hope you can see it and it's not too small, but I think this can demonstrate, and it's true with all identifiers really, about you kind of can get as much out of them as you put into them. So in terms of them being useful for disambiguation, so I have another colleague called Christine Ferguson, and there's one Christine Ferguson here who has, she's known by various different names, and we can see here that she's updated her affiliations. So, we know that, if you know anything about her, or if you saw an affiliation, for example, on an article or on a data set, you could work out who, if you searched for her in the ORCID registry, you'd be able to work out, yeah, that's the one. But then we've got these other ones, and they don't have any affiliation detail. And those, when I clicked through those profiles, there wasn't really any information in them. They might even have been private, so I couldn't see anything about them. And then, actually, maybe wasn't necessarily that useful in terms of realizing some of these benefits. So I would encourage you to try and populate your profile and keep them up to date as well, which can sometimes be a bit challenging. In terms of linking, so this is a reference list from an article. And as you can see, we've got a lot of DOIs in the reference list, and through that we can link through. And this helps with things like calculating, the citation counts of articles and other types of services. So there's, we may talk about this a bit more, but if you're using various repositories, this really speaks to the benefit of the richness of the metadata you provide if you're ever sharing your data. By providing like related identifiers and stuff, you can really enhance the capacity of what is possible to do and to learn from your resources. So the work I'm involved with, and that the FREYA project is trying to create, they're trying to create a thing called a PID graph. So a graph of persistent identifiers, and from that they want to, they're looking at the ways in which they can use the metadata that's in the associated with various persistent identifiers to learn things from these sort of two-step relationships. So things like taking an author of an article and being able to find out who all of their co-authors are, because if you've got that information in the metadata, you can sort of learn that. You can look and answer all these very interesting questions. So there's quite a lot of power within these, and the fact, and because they're curated centrally and it's a central registry, it's sort of going into the central pool where it can be used. Did the FAIR principles come up at all yesterday? They probably would have done. Persistent identifiers help make research fair, because if you have a persistent identifier, you're in the center of the resource, or you yourself, if you're talking about a person identifier, you are in the central registry. It is indexed. It's harvested by many other registries. It's immediately a lot more findable. Also, as we were talking about with the URLs and the persistence of the identifier and the fact it's a long-lasting link to a resource, that makes it more accessible. When I was talking about the linking and stuff, that speaks towards the interoperability, and as well with the long-lasting nature of the resource as well, it becomes more reusable. So all four of the FAIR principles are assisted by assigning persistent identifiers. Nope. There we go. So does anyone know how to get a persistent identifier? Apart from, okay, so you all apparently have ORCIDs. That's great. So you all know how to do that, which is good. If you wanted to get a DOI for a data set, would you know where to go, what to do, how to go about it?
Put it in a
Repository,
repository.
yeah. Such as? Zenodo, yeah. Does anyone know of any other data repositories where you could deposit data? Yeah.
Well, sometimes there are libraries from universities that distribute.
Yeah,
DOI
so
as well.
institutional repositories, yeah, great. Any other ones? Picture, yeah. If you wanted to get a DOI for a piece of software, anyone know? Any ideas? Okay, so to do that, do people here use GitHub at all? Those of you who work with software? Yeah, okay, great. Were you aware that GitHub has an integration with Zenodo?
Yes.
Okay, so what you can do with that is, have you used it? No, okay. But if you, what you can do is you can use your GitHub credentials to log into Zenodo, and then you can commit a repository from GitHub, and you can create a DOI for that, and it's pushed into Zenodo. So it's which can be useful. And yeah, definitely a lot of institutions have a repository of some description where you can deposit your data. Another thing I'd say, and this is maybe a little bit off topic, but in terms of these, particularly these Figshare and Zenodo, which are sort of very general purpose repositories that you can put lots of different types of things in there. You can put things like presentations, posters, reports, and any types of resources that you create in whatever way. You can give them an identifier by depositing them in these repositories.
Can I have a question?
Sure.
Just something very basic. Is it expensive to maintain a DOI?
For the registration agencies?
Yeah, because for us it's for free, because you just go to any of these repositories, so it's virtually free. But for the other side?
Yeah, no, there's costs, very much.
How costly?
How costly? Well, it varies quite a lot, and it depends who kind of along the food chain you're talking to, because there is, for example, Zenodo is run by CERN, who have the CERN, who are based in Switzerland, and they have the Large Hadron Collider, and they create huge amounts of data. And so I've heard, I don't know this categorically, but I have heard that apparently they just have so much storage and they invest so heavily in data storage that for them to run Zenodo, it's no big problem. But there are costs associated with it in terms of creating DOIs as well.
Right. So like for GitHub, which is for free, it's a repository, probably does not have that large infrastructure that CERN has. Why does it make DOIs for free for us?
Well, GitHub only does it through Zenodo.
Okay.
So for GitHub, you push it to Zenodo, but they have this sort of automatic integration, so you don't have to.
Let's say Figshare then, because institutional repositories have the funding from the institution, so they have the money.
Yeah.
It comes from above. But like Figshare, I don't think they have big income revenue.
Well, they have an institutional offering, which universities pay for, and I think that offsets it. Also, I wouldn't care to comment on, it's owned by Digital Science, which also runs things like symplectic elements and various other different types of services, and I wouldn't care to comment on their business models, but you can imagine that there might be, that there's certain things that make money and certain things don't, maybe, I don't know. In terms of creating DOIs though, that aspect of it, so there are two main DOI sort of bodies. There's Crossref, who generally look after journals and sort of more traditionally published content, I suppose. And then you've got DataCite, who do data sets and things. So Zenodo, for example, they'd have an agreement with DataCite, and they'd pay a certain amount of money per year, and then it's like banded according to things like how many DOIs you create and how big an institution you are in your turnover and all those sorts of things that factor into it. And the reason I'm being very vague about it is because they're just in the process of changing it, and I can't remember what the new one is. So there are various business models. Okay. Sorry. Yes.
But it's no difference what is behind the DOI, if it's a data set or an application or presentation. This doesn't matter to the costs or the creation of the DOI.
No, it doesn't really.
There, it's stored somewhere else.
Yeah, I mean, so I suppose, so there's the kind of, actually, and I apologize because I did conflate the two. I mean, so there's sort of the repository costs of like running a repository, but then in terms of the actual costs associated with DOI, a lot of those are actually more human costs. So, when we were talking, like what you were asking about with if you were to update them, that's quite a human process that you need some human intervention. So a lot of the cost is actually more about like people and that sort of maintenance, and the fact that you need someone to care about it still and to manage it and to do that administration. But yeah, so it doesn't. And I suppose the more DOIs you have, maybe the more people you might need as well. So that would be an element of cost. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the cost per DOI, it doesn't necessarily. necessarily vary very much.
Sorry, I think it matters a little bit if it's, for example, for journals, because I assign DOIs for our institute and we have a membership of Crossref, and if it's a current journal, then it is, for example, $1 per article.
Yes, yeah,
and
that's
then
true.
if it's archived, then it's less. So it matters in that sense.
Yeah, okay, yeah. And as, Crossref and DataCite are quite different models as well, so.
May I ask something from the perspective of institutional repository?
Yeah.
Where you have, you may have data sets and you may have publications. So, how will you choose who is your registration agency, for instance? Should you have data site for data sets and
so coming from the UK, the most universities, well, actually, I'm just thinking, sorry, I'm thinking aloud now.
probably members of Crossref?
A lot of UK universities are members of DataCite, but then some are members of Crossref as well through those various mechanisms that you can use during Crossref. Hardy, yes.
Yeah, so in my previous institute in Lancaster, we just, a few years ago, we got a data repository, so we subscribed to DataCite and minted data DOIs for data sets, but we also started minting DataCite DOIs for our thesis, so for public, and that works just as well because there are the metadata you can send to DataCite can be for a publication as well as it can be for dataset. So I don't see any reason why you would have to subscribe to both agencies.
Some do though, and I do know that some do. There's not necessarily. It comes down to things like metadata
I guess if you're a big journal, if you have a university press as well, for example.
Yeah, but we can have university press with Crossref and repository with DataCite, so maybe that is...
Yeah, you can do, but I think you could also, or like it depends what it does very much depend about what you're trying to do and what you were, because I mean, the DataCite metadata accommodates theses very well.
It does, yeah. And you have, as a library, you pay a subscription or a membership fee with DataCite, and that was about €1,500 a year. So you have to think about it. I don't know how much Crossref, you said it's a different business model, but why would you pay twice for persistent identifiers that do the same thing more or less? I don't see the point.
If I may add, also in Italy we have the same. So we use the DOI provided by DataCite through a consortium agreement at national level, but we use it also for the journals we publish on OJS. So it's perfectly fine also with publications.
Yeah, so there's, my understanding is that Crossref have a sort of different and more publications-focused metadata model. So that may be a reason why you would want to go down that route, depending on the types of resources that you're going to be creating and the institutional agreements. So I think I have probably covered most of this. So beyond formal citations, though, I did want to highlight this, that I would encourage you, if you were ever doing things like tweeting and something that you've just published, or blogging about it, to make sure that you link through the DOI rather than through a standard URL, just from the point of view of that for one thing, sort of the counting. There's statistics models associated with persistent identifiers as well, so you can sort of you get a better view of like how many times your resource has been viewed and things, and also just for a longevity perspective, like particularly maybe for a blog, for example, to just use persistent identifiers. And I said that already. Obviously, when citing others' work, I hope. Also, just you can use your ORCID in lots of different locations and just get that visibility and out there. Can anyone think of anywhere else? So I appreciate that was not an exhaustive list. Any other times that you might want to use a persistent identifier? No? Okay. Oh yeah. Sorry, I didn't expect them all to come up. Okay, yeah, so that was a little bit earlier than I was expecting, but that's okay. Do you want to take a break for maybe 10 minutes or so? Is that, or would you rather go on and we can take a break a little bit later? I don't mind.
Quick comfort break.
Quick comfort break, okay, yeah. So do you want to, should we say 10 minutes because it's 10 to the hour, so I'll come back at 11. All right, thank you. And can you, yeah, just take one and pass it on. One, yeah, as well. I hope we've got enough. Okay. Take this back. All right. Are there any spares, or are we a bit short? Or are there some extras? Sorry, thanks. And is it? Okay, so some people might have to share. Sorry, yeah, this feels very strange. Okay, so we're a bit, okay, so perhaps you can work in pairs if we're, because yeah, I wasn't sure how many people we would be, so I don't think I've got quite enough. But great. So this is a bit of an old school exercise. I don't know, we'll see how this goes. Can you, so this is an article that I thought might be of interest to you generally, because it's about citation of digital resources. But one thing I did just to sort of demonstrate, so basically I've removed the citations. So I'd like you to go through, at least to page 6, there's a paragraph break at that point, or a section break. And just have a quick, just go through and just make a note of where you think there should be a citation. And the other thing that I'd like you to do is to have a go at sort of thinking, because oh, is there a spare one? And the other thing I was hoping if you could do was, so there is a data set used in this article, so can you have a go at writing a citation for the data set? So we'll spend maybe 10 minutes or so. Okay. Well, you can keep reading through if you'd like, but can I ask, because it seems like most of you have kind of finished reading, can I ask do you have any observations or reflections on reading the article, just from the point of view of, did it seem strange to you to read it kind of without citations? A few nods. Would anyone care to say why? Did it?
Just that there were no references.
Yeah, but what did that what did that make you think? Did you sort of think, what, it's strange? What? Strange, yeah. Well, that's,
like an empty box,
Yeah.
There are quotation marks, but you don't know who's saying that.
Yeah.
There's certain articles, a certain study, they say that and that and that, but you don't know what's the article, you don't know the author, nothing at all.
Yeah. Okay. And why do you think that's a problem?
I'd like to see that study. I'd like to read more about it, not just that sentence that's quoted.
Yeah. So I suppose Yeah, exactly. So I think it goes to the point of view about the, it's real information literacy 101, sort of first year undergraduate stuff, but it's the, why you cite work. But so I can show, sorry, hide my screen. So this is the article. It does exist in like a real form with citations. There are many of them. I just counted down so I've got them all highlighted where I took them out. But down as far as the bit which says, just below the, where it goes to British History Online and eBBO as case studies, just down as far as there's actually 12 citations. Did any of you sort of feel, did you capture about that number? Is that, yeah. So, and some of it is quite, like, I can, I'm very aware that you all know this, but, it's quite interesting. Like, we have so many works here that are cited. I think the other thing that I did find interesting about it is sort of the range of resources that are cited as well. That one? Is that going to work for me, is it? Yeah. Anyway, it's just that there's newspapers and stuff cited in it as well, which I thought might be interesting. Okay, what else was I going to ask you about this? In terms of the content of the article, did anyone else, it's a bit unrelated to the subject of data citation, but I wasn't sure I thought you might find it interesting given that most of you have some humanist interest. I mean, in terms of your own citation practices, did that reflect what you do as well? The actual content of the article? No, citing print, or do you all cite digitally all the time? No one cares to volunteer. Fair enough. Right. Now, the other thing I asked you to do was, and you can do this on the fly if you haven't gotten around to doing it, and one thing, that I think is notable is that if you go down through the citations in the actual version of record of the article, is that in all of these, there is actually no data set mentioned at all. That they, but obviously, a survey was conducted and that there is data that would sit behind this. So, Jonathan very kindly gave me permission to completely ruin his article and take all the citations out of it. But for Jonathan's benefit in his absence, would anyone care to try and develop, if he had shared his survey data, which didn't happen, but would anyone care to think about how you would cite that? In terms of a citation like the ones that we sort of arranged earlier, like how you would cite, if you were to make that data set available and you wanted to cite it if you're in your own work. What would be the first bit that you'd start with? Be the first component of a citation.
So is the survey deposited anywhere? Or?
No, it hasn't been deposited. So it hasn't been deposited. But if it were, or if you were citing it just as a contact the author to access this, if you wanted to cite this data set that's unpublished, yeah.
First should be the creator.
Creator, yeah. So in that case, that's so Jonathan Blaney. So probably, actually, did I reach? Okay, well, I'll just take it off for a second. Sorry. Okay. So you start with Blaney. And then title, say survey results or publisher survey results maybe?
No citation.
Okay, any suggestions?
Well, I know some repositories. I know they are very vague, so they would say data underpinning under the article.
Very, yes.
Which, because it could be the survey results, but it could be other data as well.
Yes, very good point.
So that's a kind of a catch-all. You might say that's too vague and you don't know what data you get, but
Very
I know
true.
repositories that do that.
Yes. I know researchers that do that.
Yeah.
Quite well. So we say survey of publishers on citation. Let's call it that. And then I'm following, thinking about where else, what else do we need to put in? Any thoughts based on those examples that we worked with earlier? Say,
The type, so data set.
data set, yeah. And something else, maybe.
The DOI.
DOI, yes, of course. And also, in this delightful hypothetical world where these things all get shared all the time, you probably have your, like the repository or the publisher of the results. So, it's like my favorite number. And then DOI. So it's much easier to do these when it's actually your data. I think it's fair to say. I'll leave that there and I will put my mic back on. Sure.
Because here the printed version, we have as unit the pages. And in the case of here in the site, the unit is the paragraphs. How can I cite it?
I mean, this is just something this is not a citable version. Like, I wouldn't say that. This was just something I did as an illustrative example. And I mean, even, like, my page numbers are slightly different to your page numbers because it was getting really long, so I made the images smaller on the ones that I printed out for you, which just shows you, like, the risks of these things. So, yeah, I think the paragraph would be the unit of citation, because the one that was I showed you in the browser, this one, I mean, this is the version of record, so this would be what you would use for citation purposes. Definitely, please do not use this version.
There are some like new standards for these because when you have to cite specific parts of text, we usually have to put like the page, like page 2 or 3, or no. Because it's something like, for me, it's very new, like thinking about the unit as paragraphs.
Yeah, I think I would believe that it's because this is an online-only journal, so I think that's why they use paragraph as a unit. But yeah, generally speaking, for citation, you would use the page. Okay. Great. So we've kind of talked about this a bit already, but the standard sort of, as I said, first year undergraduate, why do you cite resources? Reading this, did any of you think that there should be a dataset citation in this article? Like, or did you sort of feel the lack of it? A citation of the dataset? That the dataset should have been made available for this article, or do you think that it was sufficient? Yeah, it's hard. I think because in this instance, quite a lot of the data has been made, sort of in the article, really. So it's it just shows you. But I think there'd be some merit in the sort of raw results, maybe, as well. How many of you have heard about kind of the drive towards research reproducibility? I wonder, Ershbet, did you talk about that yesterday?
No.
No? Okay.
No.
Okay, so one of the main drivers really for citation of data specifically is around reproducibility, and that was mentioned a little bit in the video that we watched at the start, that the idea that to fully understand what's going on in a piece of research that you're reading about in, say, an article form or in a book, that it's important to be able to drill down and fully understand by looking at the data itself and looking at what the author actually worked with and how they came to their conclusions. So that's one of the big drivers for citation of data. And then, of course, as well, software, because software, of course, is it can be the main sort of like methodology that you use. It's the tool that you use to get the results that you produce in your publication. So for that reason, those citations, by citing them in your work, and or if you use other people's software or data, it just obviously lends credence to your argument and allows people to like fully understand and comprehend your work. So here we go, finally, the format. Let's see, how did I do? So the examples that we had down here as well, the three, they were all based on this. And I thought this was quite interesting, and it wasn't necessarily, I mean, I don't think it's necessarily reflected in the examples we had, but location, for example. So obviously author, publication date, and title, I think all of them were quite consistent in having that, and they all had, it was all fairly straightforward from that perspective. Then it gets a bit more complex when you get into things like location. I adapted this from this how-to guide about how to cite data sets. That's not necessarily, it wouldn't have been what I would have initially thought of as being vital. I mean, I know it's standard in citation of print resources, but for data sets, it wasn't something I'd seen much of. The ones I put under also, I think, are actually quite primary in a lot of ways. So version is really important, particularly if you are, would any of you be dealing with dynamic data sets, so things that get changed over time? Anyone? Ershvet? Okay.
Yes.
So
it's about building a collection. At Research Discovery Platform, we have a collection where we collect literature. Guess what about open science? And it's a query-based something, also with hints of manual curation, so it's changing over time. And we were really grateful for the platform that they are able to provide us with the DOI so that we can cite the collection. What they do is that they do daily snapshots, so it's not real-time dynamic, but at least to some extent dynamic. So the DOI is able to function as a real PID also while the content changes.
Yeah. So I know this is something that a lot of like repository softwares can struggle with sometimes. They don't necessarily provide a huge amount of support for versions and things that change over time. Generally speaking, if you are dealing with something that changes, for example, it gets updated, or for example, within social sciences, if you're dealing with a cohort study, you'll have a set of results for 2019, and then you'll get another set of results for 2020, and you'll add those to your data set. For each time you have a new version or a significant change to the data set, you should, by rights, create a new DOI, and then create a relationship between the previous DOI and the new DOI. So versioning can be really important. It's also really important in software where you tend to have huge numbers of versions as well. Identifier, by that I mean the persistent identifier, the DOI. So obviously that's, if you ask me, that's incredibly important. The other thing, resource type, which we had there as data set, that tends to be one of the reasons why you need to think about that, particularly if you are depositing data and publishing it yourself, is that to get, it's one of the mandatory fields for getting a DOI. That's one of the things that you do have to state definitively. The others are, author, publication date, title, publisher, which might be, so, if it's an institutional repository, for example, it would be the institution's name would be the publisher, and resource type. And some repositories require description as well. In terms of a resource, so these how-to guides are quite useful, quite long, but of interest as well. It is dated 2015, but it was updated more recently, I believe. There is a group called Force 11. I don't know if any of you are familiar with them. So they are, so the future of research communications and e-scholarship. So they are a group of people who come together to look at sort of how things are changing within scholarly communications. And in 2014, they put together these data citation principles. And these are sort of the things that you should think about when you are citing data. And persistent is in there. But the first one, of course, is importance. And we've covered, these things get covered sort of as part of general, importance around research data and its importance and things. But in terms of citation, the reason you cite it is because it is an important resource. Credit is also really, really vital, particularly where you've got sort of large groups of people working on research projects together. As we were saying, number 3, I think that what we were sort of about how it's kind of strange when you're reading something that doesn't have citations in it. And of course, for evidence, it's vital. Unique identification, we talked loads about that already. Also access and persistence. I think one of the things that can be very difficult sometimes is specificity and verifiability, but definitely I think specificity can be difficult. If you're citing, if you have a very large data set and you're just talking about a subset, how do you deal with that? Has anyone come across those sorts of issues before in terms of citation? Party?
Yeah, if you have hierarchical data sets, a lot of, our institutional repository struggles with that, but then we know that researchers use, you can put it on Google in a more structured form or other places. I think you have to be thinking of that at the very beginning. Yeah. If you create a complex data set, where is a good place for that to live? Yeah, and how? And I think citations of those subsets can be very difficult to deliver. I know within the earth science community, there are a couple of repositories within that domain that have now developed functionality where you can sort of create you sort of select what you want to work with, and then they will create a DOI and allow you to download the subset with the DOI. And then when you look at the DOI in the future, it will allow you to see both a snapshot of what you have created at that time, but then also if it has changed at all, because they're dynamic data sets as well. So, so these are some of the challenges that you can come across. I mean, has anyone here come across some of these? Sorry, I've asked this already, but is there anyone else who's experienced these things firsthand? Yeah.
Well, it's a problem when you have these packages of, you can have multiple files of data, then another file that will be assigned a separate DOI, and how will you treat that as separate objects, or so, yeah, same from the aspect of institutional repository, for instance. It's a complicated issue.
Yeah. Yeah. Does anyone have an example of like where you've had to make a choice, or yeah?
Well, what I've done in the past, for example, when working with EBO, which is a collection of English literature, it's very, very commonly used. People usually just select a portion of it and work on that, and they cite the original work that it's coming from. They specify in textual form, I extracted this part and this part, I'm working on this, and the original citation becomes the one to the original.
Okay, so what you actually can cite is larger, and then you sort of specify it within your methodology or whatever.
But
Okay.
there's not a formal way to specify you're working with a slide or something like that.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And yeah, interoperability and flexibility. So I think that speaks to the fact that I was quite lax about the formats and stuff of citations. Obviously they're important, but they are very variable across different styles. So, I thought for the purposes of this general session, it's not necessarily vital to focus so much on the different styles. But here are these examples laid out as they should be. So I think they were all, are they all okay? Just having a look. Oh, the dates got mixed up. Jeez. Sorry. The dates, I think, got mixed up between this one and that one over there, but never mind. I think they're all pretty much correct. Some things to show you about them. Will it open? Hopefully it will. So these are the actual records themselves, so you can just see what we're talking about. So this is from the archaeology data service. And as you can see, there's a data set, and then you can download it. That one's fairly straightforward. This one didn't hyperlink, which isn't ideal. That one was done in Chicago, as I described. And then this. Sorry, yes?
There is not just for data sets, but for publications also. There is a discrepancy between, for instance, cross-ref suggestions, how to specify DOI in a citation, and from this citation, for instance, APA in Chicago. They want to have just DOI without the HTTPS part, so it doesn't make a link. And it's quite annoying from the point of view of the reader, because you have to add that part to make it a link and go there. And now the cross-ref specifically said that it has to be a whole URL.
Yeah.
Yeah. This citation style is a bit.
Yes, exactly. It's really annoying. Yeah, I mean, the one saving grace is that some of these systems at least do have, they have this capability. I don't know if you've seen this when you've been citing, that you can like scroll down through your styles. Big Share do this as well. You can pick out whichever type. As you can see, there are many of them. This is the Zenodo recommended format, which is quite useful. Another, just something which I would say when it comes to versioning of identifiers, that there is not full consensus within the kind of community of identifier enthusiasts about how to manage versioning. The way Zenodo does it, which is quite heavy in the number of DOIs it creates, is that when you deposit something in Zenodo, they automatically create 2 DOIs. So they have this one that is associated with this particular version, but then they also have this one here, which is where you can, so when it comes to citation, you can cite both the like all of the versions of a data set, or the other place where this might become more relevant is within software. If you want to just cite, you know, this data set in it, or this piece of software in its entirety, don't care when it was, or, you know, the time-based aspect of it isn't relevant. You just want to cite the whole thing. You can use this DOI, whereas otherwise you can use, if you want to be very specific, you can use the different versions. And this one only has one. I've got another example further down, which is different, which has more. Yeah, so these are just some examples of the format. So you can see that they all contain pretty much this like similar information. You know, it's fairly standard. There we go. Now, does anyone have any questions on that?
Yeah, so because some of us will go out and do training with researchers,
yeah,
and there might be 5 minutes on, or less even, on data citation.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the nutshell? Because I mean,
cite your data.
This will look very familiar, like you know how a data citation. So is the message just use common sense and do it kind of similar to what you know about referencing other material, or what's the message in?
I think the message is that cite as much as you can and work within the constraints of your, you know, the conventions of your discipline, because they are very variable, and like I'm very much a generalist, and I do struggle with these disciplinary specific issues, and you know, so yeah, I think that is the main thing, and to try. And the other thing I would suggest as well is try to, you know, use of citation tools as much as possible. Like, I think they make it a lot easier as well, as much as anything, in terms of importing things and formatting things in the correct way for a particular style. You know, for example, in Zenodo, which I know we've been talking about an awful lot, but within that you can import into Mendeley, for example, and also into Cite-You-Like. So to try and pull through as much, and I think that automating, particularly when it comes to citation, I think automating it as much as possible is quite beneficial when it comes to trying to just generate citations in a consistent format as well. Yeah, I think that's probably my main.
I've got another question about citing your own data set in your publication. We discussed this earlier. I've heard, this is going back a few years, that initially we told our researchers you can reference your data set in your acknowledgements, because funders will read it and so on, and so, yeah, okay, that's fine maybe, but I heard you have to have it in the reference section, otherwise Crossref will not crawl it and you won't get citations.
Yes, actually, sorry, yes, that is correct. Okay. Yes, and I don't know if you're familiar with the Open Citation initiative from that perspective as well, from when it comes to exposing citations. It's yes. I think the convention behind citing in the acknowledgements was just when there wasn't really a space for it. And yeah, because funders read it, but yeah, I think definitely citing it as a proper source.
The example here of PLOS, where you know they have the data availability, the header basically. Yeah. But then you would also have to put the data set in a reference to tick the citations box. Is that correct?
I don't know about that.
Exposed, yeah.
I don't know how that. My feeling is that PLOS probably would expose that to Crossref. I say this on the basis that PLOS is very well resourced and thinks about these things quite a lot. So yeah, where you've got specific data availability statements as opposed to just trying to shoehorn a data citation in somewhere into your into sort of your main text or whatever. But I think to be on the safe side, it probably is sufficient, or it is preferable to sort of have it in both places, and then you can always deal with that when it comes to the editorial process if you're publishing as well, that it would get picked up there. And these are, I think it's completely legitimate to ask whoever you're liaising with about these things.
Is it actually a fair practice to cite your own data? Because if you have an article where you report the results of this data, you're not actually citing them, you're just reporting them. So it is logical to have them in this data availability. Unfortunately, not all journals have this kind of thing. But you're not really, it's another thing when you use someone else's data and you cite them in your paper. But when you have the original paper that reports the data results, so you're not really, it's not a citation. I don't know.
Yes, it is.
Well, it's like a reference. Yeah, it's a reference to a published work, and is another way to look at it.
Yeah, I'm not sure. There are data journals and data papers, so there are.
I've published already some articles that I have to make reference to another study I've made. So I just point that direction, but I'm not going to talk about it again.
Yeah, but if it's the first time that you are talking about it.
Oh, that's not a citation.
That's what I
sorry.
In that case, you're not really citing
It's
your.
kind of
Yeah,
supplementary material in a
Yeah.
way, so it's
Yeah. I mean, I don't think there's a standard practice for this. Is the short answer. I think what I would say though is that it's important that you make that connection in some way.
Example that you showed us in this paper, they are dealing with this the results of the survey. They are reporting them here originally for the first time, so they are not citing some other data set.
Yeah. So how would you deal with? So how would you advise dealing with that if you were to make the sort of full data set, a sort of database available?
It would be a great thing that all journals start doing what PLOS and some other journals are doing already, to have the specific part of the acknowledgements or, I don't know, supplementary material, data availability statement, where you, on the beginning of the paper, you state where are your data deposited and what are they. But it's not really in a reference part. I'm not sure. I'm asking.
Yeah, I don't. I'm sorry. I don't have a. I don't think there is any conclusive thing. I mean, I take your point about citations being different, but I think there's also an argument that they are a place where you put references to other material, and that therefore, in the absence of a data availability statement, that they are a place to put them. But yes, I take your point. It's not necessarily ideal. So yes, data availability statements are the way to go. Sorry.
Comment on this. Maybe the other way around it's easier. So once you share your data, many repositories, like Senado is also one of them, allows you to add associated PIDs. And if you publish with a publisher who has PIDs for the article or book chapter, then you can start a minimum PID graph where you can keep them interconnected at the data repository side. So you can direct researchers to your article from the data.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Actually, it's really important to try and do that as much as possible. I know the publishing time frames and things aren't necessarily always very conducive to doing that. But yeah, that bidirectional linking is something that really does add value. So by bidirectional linking, I mean where one thing links to the other and back again. That you have that both the data set and the software and the article, that they all, or if you have all three in play, that they all contain links to the other two. Because yeah, exactly, it drives traffic as much as anything. I think the only thing that is maybe not so ideal about that, Ishmael, is that because of, rightly or wrongly, because of the primacy of the kind of publication, that the majority of the traffic does tend to go through the through the publication rather than through the data set. So moving on then, gosh, time is pressing on. The Force, so the same organization, they also developed something similar for software. So they software citation principles. Now, I'm conscious that that is very tiny. So to be honest, they align pretty much exactly with the data citation principles. They're just a bit more recent because I think, so back in 2014, everyone sort of was like, okay, yeah, data, I've got to make sure data is important. That was where the thrust was. And then 2 years on, in 2016, everyone realized software was equally important as well, and hence the software citation principles. So I've got a nice graphic for this one as well. So, but yeah, so it's very similar, so that it's important, that it's uniquely identified in a persistent way, that it's specific. So as I've already mentioned, the versioning aspect with software is very much an issue. The accessibility, and then as well credit and attribution. So very similar issues. Kindly, they have, the Force working group have developed a checklist for an author, which you can access at the DOI there if you want. And you could also argue that this is relevant. You could probably replace data for some of this as well, but this is just, when you're thinking about it. So have you identified the software, including your own, which makes a significant and specialized contribution, therefore should be cited. Check the recommended citation. So particularly, creators of software might have a view around sort of versioning and things and what they would like to be cited as well. So, you should respect that. Create it as complete a citation as possible. Does it include who created the software? So these things can be, like if you're reusing someone else's stuff, it can be quite challenging to identify some of these components sometimes. So I think the point of it is do your best. But, it can be challenging. And yeah, so this again speaks to the same point. Have I referenced the software appropriately in compliance with any citation formatting guidelines? I must say, I don't know how much this would apply in arts and humanities, but within STEM, there is often a tendency that that software, much like as you were describing, where you report on the findings of your data, that you would often have papers that would sort of report on software that was developed in a similar way. So I think this issue that you were describing probably does stand for this as well. However, I think it is important that it is made fair in some way as well. So here are just some examples that I pulled very quickly this morning. They're all Zenodo, purely on the basis that Zenodo allows you to filter really nicely by the different types of resources. So I could guarantee that these were software, which was difficult to do with some of the other repositories. But they, as you can see, some of these have, this one has versioning. So I'll just open that one up so you can see. That is some wind, isn't it? So as you can see here, we've got there's two versions of this one, and they've gone for several hierarchies of changes, and as you can see, you've got the cite all versions on cite that. So there you go, and as you can see, this was one where it has been pushed through GitHub because it's available in GitHub. So if you click through, hopefully this will work. You can see if you wanted to use it through GitHub and access it that way, you can as well. Okay, potential issues. So I think we've probably covered most of these. Has anyone experienced any issues, have any views on dealing with things like embargo data or closed data? Anyone had that issue? Embargoed. Do you want an explanation of what it is, or? Yeah. So I hyperlinked it so I could show an example. Actually, this is another one. So embargo data is where, for whatever reason, and this is actually a journal article, but with supplementary information. So, for example, if you're familiar with, green open access and things, sometimes you have to embargo your papers. Likewise, you may have to do this same for supplementary information to your article. Also, there may be other reasons why you might want to restrict access to your data or your software for a particular period of time. It can be to do with gathering consent from participants, if it involves humans, commercial sensitivities potentially. There are myriad reasons why you might want to restrict it in a time-based manner. Also, it can be, sometimes data just has to be closed as well. That's something that just has to happen, where for various reasons, you just can't make it publicly available, which is just a kind of fact of life, really, for, again, commercial sensitivities, human participants, anyone else. There's loads of reasons, and that is all I can think of at the moment.
In the case of archaeological data, sometimes you don't want to disclose the exact location when something was found. What would you mean, like looters or people going there?
Yeah.
Matter with access, for example.
Yeah, exactly. Anyone else? Any other reasons? There's generally speaking, you were very familiar with the archaeology example, and depending, you'll be familiar with the issues that exist in your own areas. When those of you who have already published a bit, how do you deal with supplementary materials when you're publishing? You thought about? Have any of you ever published something with supplementary materials? Yeah. Okay.
It really depends on the journal. Some journals have a section specifically designed for supplementary materials, but most journals don't.
Mm-hmm.
So we tend to just add a section. You can find all the data, all the software, all the notebooks on this address, and just give a GitHub link.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and you tend to use a GitHub link.
Yeah.
When you say notebooks, is that like Jupyter notebooks or something like that?
Our studio right now.
Okay. And yourself?
Well, back in the day, you had to submit a CD. So that was a way of submitting this data. Now it's not really accessible anymore, I guess. But yeah, through links to GitHub and other repositories.
Okay. Yeah, I think there's sometimes a bit of debate about supplementary materials, and sort of from the point of view that they, often they come with, these caveats that they're not maintained by the journal, and once they, they can be a bit of a dumping ground in some respects, that you just put in whatever materials that you want to put in with your article, and then they're just left there, and you don't necessarily have the same metadata standards that you'd have with a data set, and then that you and you don't have any of the persistence either. So some publishers are starting to, I know some publishers have agreements with Figshare, for example, where they push some of the supplementary materials into Figshare, so then it gets an identifier and it gets a bit more description. So there are various initiatives with that, but just as something to bear in mind that it can be, just because you're creating supplementary materials doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a need for a separate data citation as well. That that they're not exactly the same thing. I think it's fair to say. But again, it does vary quite a lot from journal to journal as well in terms of how they deal with that. And there was something else I was going to say about this, but I can't remember what it was. Oh yes, that was it. The supplementary materials as well, related to the next point around granularity, where if you're dealing with a subset of a data set, sometimes a supplementary materials can be a way to negotiate that to an extent as well if you have a larger data set that does have an identifier, but if you want to sort of describe in more detail or perhaps like extract from a subset of that as well, supplementary materials can provide a venue for that to take place too. Versioning. What did I do here? I can't remember. Versioning. Oh yes. So the UK Data Service who created the video that we saw earlier. So this is an example of a change log that they have for a data set that they hold. So they're a social science data service, and they collect a lot of data sets in that area. And they have this data set that gets updated like many, many times. And you can see how, if I do that, you can see the actual data set record. Oh no. Sorry, I don't know why I did that. But basically that they, here you have it where it just gets, like, it was done in April, in August, and in November. And then if you go in here, sorry, that's the correct link. You can see some details. So it's been going since 2003. So they have they have to create a new DOI every time, but they sort of have the facilities to manage that change over time. Evolving data sets as well. That's we've talked about that, and we've also talked about bidirectional linking and finding a creator. Sometimes that has anyone come across that issue? Like, it can sometimes be quite difficult to identify the creator of a data set, and I don't know. For modern data, maybe less so, but this was one which relates to some work that I'm doing at the moment in the FREYA project, where we're working on trying to enhance the provenance information for some of the data sets that are held at the British Library. And we have these, several, near about 100 so far, data sets that are derived from the metadata in our collections. And there was one where we decided we wanted to try and see how much background information we could put into this data set just to see what it looks like. So it was somewhat successful, but one of the things that was quite interesting, this already existed and it has a DOI, and there's sort of two different files, one of which is the actual the digitized files of the playbills, and then there's another one that's OCR text of the playbills. When I say a playbill, that's a poster for a play that's going to take place. So you can see where are the dates on this. They're from the sort of 19th century. But yeah, so published between 1660 and 1902, so mostly 19th century, and they're from all over the UK. And what we did was we were trying to sort of, document this, the background of this data set. And what we found was that it was quite challenging to do so. So we have the British Library Labs, who are they do a lot of the digital humanities research within the British Library, and then one of the curators as well. So she was, so we decided that they were probably creators of the data set. It was kind of difficult because when you start thinking about the actual playbills themselves, like who created those playbills? Like some printer in these various cities in the 18th century. But then we we tried to attribute the various theatres that had contributed to this. We decided to put them down as contributors, but these have a controlled list of like different types of like what type of contributor you are. And none of the types really worked. And it was, yeah, so it was quite difficult to try and find these. And we also assigned them ISNIs. So some of them had ISNIs, and we gave them. So ISNI is a name identifier. So it can be assigned to both people and to organizations as well. So so some of you might have ISNIs already, which you may or may not know about. And then the other thing we did, which I'm not sure will this work, is what you were talking about, Ursula, about the text fragments. So we use the ARC standard at the library, and let's see if that works. No. So yeah, they're not externally resolvable, so it's not going to work. But we try to, and hopefully these will become. That should have opened, and I don't know why it didn't. But the planet. These are all the files that comprise the data set, because they should be available online, and so that you could view them. But as you can see, we've got an awful lot of them, and somehow as well, some of them got cut off. So it becomes very difficult to manage these identifiers. So this is part of the work that I've been doing, trying to come up with methods to deal with this. But that was just an example. Yes?
One question that I have. There's an institutional repository just for data, or is part of the global archive of the British Library?
So it's, I mean, it's a sort of standard. It's a shared repository for publications and data sets. But so those links that didn't open, they resolved to the digital library system, which is where the kind of archive storage takes place. And that access interface, but then this repository sort of is separate to that, but equally it is part of the British Library's systems, and it's primarily for the data sets and for the research that's published by British Library staff and affiliated students.
Yeah, that's exactly my point, because I've come across in the past cases of researchers who want to do the right thing. They want to use their institutional repository, and then they discover that accession in queue, it's going to take 3 months, right, for the data to be properly available. So they need to find something else, or pictures, or whatever. So I wonder, how do you deal with accession in queues when you have a deadline, and then you want to do things right, and you want to release your data in the institutional repository, and if it's done right?
So when I worked in roles managing institutional repositories, we were quite torn sometimes, because we wanted people to deposit with us, but equally within the institutional repository, but equally there isn't really any obligation on the researcher to do that. And actually often at a sort of higher policy level, the university's management would often be quite happy for researchers to just, and particularly the IT department would be quite happy for researchers to just outsource it, because then they wouldn't have to deal with it and they wouldn't have to manage the storage and things. So in terms of accession in queues, I think that can vary from institution to institution as well. Like some places have them and some places don't. I'd be agnostic on it, on the point of view that I think it's just more important that it's out there rather than anything else. And I think having it out there in a timely manner is important. And I think it's unfortunate that sometimes that can be difficult to do internally. But yeah. Okay. Right. Okay. So all right, we've got 10 minutes left. So that was pretty much all the material I wanted to, or 15 minutes left, sorry. That was pretty much all the material I wanted to cover. One thing I did want to ask all of you, in kind of true workshop style, if you want to either write it down or if you want to volunteer to tell me I hope you found this useful, and I was wondering if there's anything particular that you've taken away from this, and what you might do yourself when you're publishing as well. And I think we might go around the room for this, if that's okay. So if you want to, does anyone have anything immediate as a starting point of what they'll do now? Yeah.
I'm still thinking about versioning a little bit, because I'm not that sure when it is a new version of the data set quite often. I got the case that researchers just want to change the title, but the data set isn't changing. So the metadata change and they want a new version. Is Is that possible? Is that correct? How do you deal with
So if the data hasn't changed, but the metadata has changed.
Yeah, because another title might be more appropriate.
So from the DOI perspective only, if the mandatory metadata fields change, then you need a new version of the DOI, or if the data files themselves change, that's when you need a new version. If you want to change the optional files, then you don't. The optional fields, sorry, metadata fields.
So a new version is when somebody has found a mistake and a correction, and then it's a new version.
Yeah, for the yes, and I appreciate so by rights, I think if you look at the sort of rules of creating DOI, they do talk about things like very minor changes don't require a new version. Okay. But in practice, a lot of the systems, when you try and change it, so for example, if it's a spelling mistake, then it's not a problem. But a lot of the systems, even though it is just a spelling mistake, they'll require a new version because that's just how they're built, and to kind of make sure that the systems are adherent with the DOI rules, I suppose, and that's the easiest way for them to do it. But it's a blunt instrument.
And when I read other articles, I think it's quite often the case that they don't cite the version at all. So that's missing in the data citation.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. Is there anything you've taken away from this that you bring forward?
Yeah, the information about the integration from GitHub and Xenodos.
Great. And sorry, is there anything? No? Okay. And you? Is there anything that you'll take away and that you'll sort of put into practice yourself?
Students to cite data regularly in their papers.
Good.
Try
And
to influence some journalists to put data availability statements there.
great. Lobby, yes. Please do. And down the front here?
Still thinking about.
Okay.
Citing digital objects as well as software citation. I don't even have an account on ORCID.
Ah, okay. Yes, get an ORCID.
And many things that I still have to take a look into after.
Great. Okay, and up the back here. Yeah. Okay. And your neighbour? No, you don't care to share? Okay. Down here?
Well, as a researcher, I'm maybe becoming more alert to separate between what is my paper, which is only the only thing I cared about, with maybe separating the data sets, the graphics, and so on. I'm trying to be more sensitive to that aspect.
Okay, great.
It was very useful, and I hope it will lead to better citation practice in my work in the future. And your advice of doing it as much automatically as possible is also useful.
Okay, good. And behind, anything like
Update my ORCID account.
Or okay. It's probably most people, including myself, could take that advice. Yeah.
I will create an ORCID. And I also work as assistant to editor for institutional journals, so I take care of citations, but I've never seen data citations, so I take care of that for sure.
Okay. Maybe you can answer the question as well, and to come up with something of a definitive practice on this. Okay. And behind you?
This was very useful to remind me of the importance to cite software and data sets, basically.
Okay.
Among other things, I'm an editor in journals, so I will probably continue to force all the authors to provide DOI and students and so on.
Great.
So it's like, let's continue.
I found the citation information very useful, and also the versioning. I never thought about DOIs for newer versions, so I think it's quite a good idea.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I think it might be you there are a lot of things to do now. Yeah, we're not really aware of DOIs, and I think I will start with an account as well.
Actually, I never heard about the software citation principles. I really thought that. A little bit ashamed that I knew.
You're not the only one who hasn't heard of them. I ran a 2-day, well, in consultation with some people, we ran a 2-day workshop on them earlier this year, and most people there hadn't heard of them either, so I wouldn't worry.
Well, I guess one of the things that I'm still thinking about is the practicality of using DOIs. Well, at least in my case, I kind of still am in between using analog sources and something that would have a DOI. So of course, more recent publications, I guess they would have them, so the publisher would just give it to them. So I'm thinking about the older publication, not older as in century, but more like in the 70s or in the 80s. Sometimes we do use them. And so when we were reading the article that you gave us as exercise, one of the things that they were asking is whether the researchers would switch to a digital version if the work had a digital version, so signing the DOI. And I was thinking, well, I mean, and so there was some resistance about it. And one of the things that I was thinking is I would use whatever source I used. So if it was an online source and if it was physical, even if it had a digital format, I was still.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is best practice if you've used the physical one.
Yeah. So, but I mean, for dissemination and for research, and we have to be visible, we have to be social, so the DOI is more useful. So I'm kind of still thinking how.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, actually. Yeah, because I think the viewpoint that article came from was the idea that like everyone's using these online resources, but they're citing print ones. But the chances of them, like people actually having, seeing these versions in print is quite unlikely a lot of the time. But where you actually have, it's an interesting issue. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, definitely. Yourself, anything you'd like to add?
For me as a librarian, it all comes down to information literacy, and it comes down to information literacy from a really, really young age than, when you reach the age of the researcher, like the stage of, and of course the persistent identifiers, it's an addition to practicality and, avoid ambiguance and, all these practicalities that they bring along. But at the end of the day, you need to have, academic honesty, let's say, principles embedded to you from a really young age. And I don't know, with university students, of course, we can always, create workshops, citations and academic honesty and things like that, and of course, insist on the ways that, citation include the data sets, the softwares, everything.
I know you joined late. Do you have anything you want to add? Yeah. Sure.
I apologize, I missed the first part.
That's okay. Don't worry. No, sorry. I didn't mean that as an accusation.
You covered it in the part, so I was just wondering exactly how DOIs work in the sense of who's behind that. It's in a foundation, a private company. How reliable are they going to be? How future-proof?
Would you mind if we talk about that at lunch, maybe? Is that okay? Because I've kind of bored them all with this already. We covered it a bit, so I won't go over it again, so we can talk about it. Yeah. Hardy, is there anything you'd like to add?
What wasn't in scope today, but what I'm thinking as a librarian is also when we talk about citations as a carrot for researchers to share data, we're not very good, as far as I can see, in providing evidence that data sets are cited, and that's beneficial for researchers because you get more citations or more kudos and recognition of your work.
I think some new work has come out on that quite recently, actually, which I was trying to get for you. Yeah, there has been a little bit about that. That's like sort of more because there has been some work about, you know, open data increases your citation and that's stuff. But there's, I think, some more recent work on that. So let me look into that. Lisbon, is there anything you'd like to add? You heard? Okay.
Work more together with FREYA.
Yeah.
So this is one thing. But also, like, we are doing a lot for propagating data citation within DARIAH, but maybe we could do more. And, well, we also now have to figure out a very specific problem regarding the granularity of GitHub repository integration for scenario. This is technical stuff. This is the next step for the week for us to figure
I think, if you don't mind me saying, I think DARIAH could provide some really good like leadership and guidelines on this. So, you know, I've sort of presented like the best of my knowledge, but I think, you know, if DARIAH, particularly with that like sort of discipline-specific mindset, I think it could be quite useful if someone would. Because I think sometimes these things just come down to someone making a decision, and I think maybe, you know, as you've seen, there's maybe some vagueness because sort of best practice hasn't yet disseminated. Okay, so we've got 3 minutes, so we can do this in 3 minutes. So as I mentioned, I'm working on this EU project, and one of the things that I'm involved in quite a lot of is the training materials around this. And for that reason, I'm trying to gather some evaluations of the various training and stuff that the project is delivering. This session is one of those things. So there's a short link URL there to a short evaluation form. It really will take 2 minutes. But if I could ask you to complete that, I would really appreciate it. I'm sure you probably will have one for the school as a whole as well, but this is just about this session. I would really value it if you wouldn't mind filling that in. Yeah, just from the point of view of my own reporting and things that I'll need to do. So if you wouldn't mind, that would be great. And otherwise, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you found it useful. Please do feel free to ask any questions at lunch. I'm around until about 4 today, so please feel free to ask me. All right, thank you.